Preserved in a glass jar filled with formaldehyde in the psychology department of Cornell University sits one of the most notorious brains in American criminal history. Belonging to a man who could speak 8 languages fluently, translate ancient Greek texts, and formulate complex theories about human linguistics, it measured 1,673 centimeters. Yet this same brilliant mind orchestrated brutal murders that shocked 19th-century America. The brain was that of Edward Howard Rulloff, teacher, doctor, inventor, philologist, and killer. For decades, authorities across New York State struggled to understand how such calculated evil could coexist with such intellectual brilliance. Tonight, we uncover the chilling truth behind the man newspapers called the genius killer. This is a story of academic ambition funded by blood, where the pursuit of knowledge became an obsession that justified murder. Before we continue with the story of Edward Rulloff and his reign of terror across New York's Finger Lakes region, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We upload new dark mysteries every week, and we'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling us your state or city. The case of Edward Rulloff would forever change how Americans viewed the criminal mind, proving that evil could wear the mask of scholarly respectability and that genius itself could become a weapon of destruction. The year was 1842, and alive with opportunity and transformation were the rolling hills of central New York. Sleepy farming communities had been turned into bustling trade centers by the Erie Canal. Meanwhile, the region had been filled with religious fervor and social reform movements by the Second Great Awakening. In this new America, education was becoming the pathway to prosperity, and small towns competed to attract learned men who could elevate their cultural standing. Into this landscape of hope and progress arrived a young man named Edward Rulloff in the village of Dredon, just east of Ithaca. To the locals, he seemed like a gift from Providence itself. 23 years old, Rulloff was tall and distinguished-looking, with a commanding presence that immediately set him apart from the rough canal workers and farmers who typically passed through town. His dark hair was meticulously groomed, his clothing was neat and scholarly, and his piercing dark eye seemed to hold depths of knowledge that impressed everyone he met. When he spoke, it was with the cultured accent of an educated gentleman, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Rarely had the residents of Dredon encountered anyone with such apparent erudition. Extensive knowledge of botany and medicine was claimed by Rulloff. He could recite passages in Latin, Greek, and German with fluid precision, and he seemed equally comfortable discussing philosophy, literature, and the emerging sciences. When he began delivering lectures on phrenology, the popular pseudoscience of reading character through skull measurements, the townspeople gathered in amazement at his apparent mastery of this fashionable field of study. But beneath this impressive exterior lay secrets that would have horrified his admirers. Born John Edward Howard Ruff son near St. John, New Brunswick around 1819 or 1820, he had already lived a double life before crossing into the United States. A Danish immigrant, his father, Rudolf Rulifson, had achieved some prosperity as a justice of the peace, but the family's fortunes had declined after his death in 1827. Early promise as a scholar had been shown by young Edward, devouring books with an insatiable hunger for knowledge that impressed his teachers and neighbors alike. However, his intellectual gifts had been corrupted by an early taste for crime. By the time he reached his teens, Edward had been caught in a series of suspicious fires at the dry goods store where he worked, arson apparently designed to cover up inventory thefts. When he was observed wearing clothing that matched items reported stolen, he was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 2 years in prison. A wake-up call the experience should have been, but instead it became his criminal education, teaching him the value of careful planning and the importance of maintaining a respectable facade. After his release, he had crossed into the United States, abandoning his birth name for the more distinguished Edward Rulloff. More than cosmetic was the change. It represented his transformation from common criminal to something far more dangerous, a predator who could blend seamlessly into respectable society. Time to study and plan had been given to him by his years of imprisonment, emerging with a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate others through displays of learning and charm. In Dredon, Rulloff quickly established himself as an invaluable member of the community. Employment was found by him as a clerk in the local drugstore, where his apparent knowledge of botanical medicines impressed both his employer and customers. Boundless seemed his learning. He could discuss the latest philosophical works from Europe, analyze political developments with insight, and demonstrate practical knowledge of everything from photography to carpentry. Starved for intellectual stimulation in their rural setting, the community embraced him with an enthusiasm that fed his growing sense of superiority. Rapidly through the region grew his reputation. Farmers consulted him about their crops. Local politicians sought his advice on matters of governance, and prominent families invited him to dinner parties where his conversation was the evening's entertainment. Soon, the position of headmaster at their local school was offered to him by the community, a role that would give him not only respectability but access to young minds he could influence and potentially corrupt. Among his pupils was 17-year-old Harriet Shutt, daughter of one of the area's most respected farming families. Considered a rare beauty, even in a region known for its handsome women, was Harriet, tall and slender with long light brown hair that caught the sunlight, pale skin that spoke of genteel upbringing, and hazel eyes that sparkled with intelligence and gentle humor. The kind of refined mannerisms and educated speech that marked her as gentry in this rural community were possessed by her, having been fortunate enough to receive more education than most young women of her time. Through hard work and careful management of their substantial farm holdings, the Shutt family had prospered. Among the area's most prominent citizens they were, known for their generosity to neighbors and their active participation in community affairs. A man of considerable influence was Harriet's father, John Shutt, who took pride in his daughter's accomplishments and had high expectations for her future marriage. Everything that was stable and respectable about rural American life in the 1840s was represented by the family. Immediate and intense was the attraction between teacher and student, though it would prove to be built on the most dangerous foundation imaginable. Despite his scholarly demeanor, Rulloff possessed a magnetic charisma that drew people to him like moths to a flame. Utterly charming he could be when it suited his purposes, weaving tales of his travels and studies that painted him as a man of the world who had seen wonders beyond the provincial horizons of central New York. For a young woman like Harriet, living within the comfortable but confining boundaries of rural society, he represented everything exotic and sophisticated that her sheltered life had never offered. But even in these early days of courtship, there were warning signs that those around them chose to ignore or rationalize away. Frightening in its intensity and seemingly unpredictable in its triggers could be Rulloff's temper when provoked. An almost pathological jealousy was displayed by him whenever other men showed even innocent interest in Harriet, and his moods could shift from charming affability to cold, calculating rage in moments. While impressed by his obvious learning and apparent prospects, the Shutt family harbored private doubts about their daughter's suitor that they found difficult to articulate. On December 31, 1843, as heavy snow blanketed the Finger Lakes region and families throughout central New York gathered for New Year's celebrations, Edward Rulloff and Harriet Shutt were united in marriage during a simple but well-attended ceremony at the Shutt family farm. A joyous occasion the wedding should have been, marking the beginning of a promising union between two intelligent young people. But even on this day meant for celebration, Rulloff's true nature began to emerge in ways that should have terrified everyone present. Normally the ceremony itself proceeded until the traditional moment when the minister, following time-honored custom, congratulated the bride with a gentle kiss on the cheek. In that instant, Rulloff's carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing the violent jealousy that would define their marriage. With such fury did his face darken that several wedding guests stepped back in alarm, and his eyes flashed with a rage so intense and unexpected that it cast a pall over the entire celebration. Here was a man flying into jealous fury over an innocent gesture from a clergyman, behavior that should have warned everyone present of the violence lurking beneath his scholarly exterior. Unsure how to interpret this disturbing outburst, the wedding guests chose to attribute it to wedding day nerves or perhaps the stress of joining a prominent family. But something in her new husband's eyes that chilled her to the bone had been seen by Harriet herself, though she told herself it was merely the intensity of his love for her. Brief and troubled was the honeymoon period that followed, marked by moments of passionate devotion interrupted by flashes of the same terrifying rage that had marked their wedding day. Within months of their marriage, Rulloff had convinced Harriet to move with him to the nearby village of Lansing, ostensibly to give them privacy to build their new life together, but really to isolate his young wife from her family's protective influence. More than a simple change of address was represented by the move. It was a calculated strategy to cut Harriet off from the support system that might have helped her escape the nightmare her marriage was becoming. In Lansing, practice as a botanical physician was set up by Rulloff, using his self-taught knowledge of herbs and medicines to treat local residents who had limited access to formally trained doctors. Rapidly grew his reputation as a healer, and soon prominent families throughout the region were seeking his services for everything from common ailments to serious medical emergencies. Reasonable fees were charged by him, and genuine concern for his patients' welfare seemed to be shown by him, further cementing his reputation as a valuable member of the community. A center of intellectual activity in the small village became the young couple's modest home. His scholarly pursuits were continued by Rulloff, filling their rooms with books on subjects ranging from classical languages to natural philosophy. Hours each day were spent by him reading and writing, working on what he claimed would be groundbreaking theories about the formation and evolution of human language. To observers, he appeared to be the ideal combination of practical healer and theoretical scholar, a man who could bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern learning. In April 1845, after more than a year of marriage, a daughter they named Priscilla was given birth to by Harriet. Healthy and beautiful was the infant, with her mother's delicate features and what appeared to be her father's intelligent eyes. For a brief time, the arrival of their child seemed to calm Rulloff's volatile nature and bring out genuinely tender qualities that few had suspected he possessed. Devoted to both his wife and infant daughter, he appeared, spending hours reading to them from his extensive library and discussing his ambitious plans for their family's future. Frequently of opportunities waiting for him in the growing territories of the American West, particularly Ohio, did Rulloff speak, where he claimed to have been offered a position as a college professor. Vivid pictures of the life they could build there were painted by him, away from the constraints and gossip of small-town New York, where his genius would finally receive the recognition it deserved. Reasonable to Harriet seemed these dreams, who had grown accustomed to her husband's grandiose visions and believed in his exceptional abilities. But the domestic tranquility was shattered by the continued presence in their lives of Dr. Henry Bull, Rulloff's business partner and Harriet's cousin. A genuine physician was Bull, who had taken Rulloff under his wing to teach him botanical medicine, impressed by the younger man's apparent knowledge and dedication. He was also a member of the extended Shutt family network, maintaining the kind of easy, affectionate relationships with his female relatives that was common in close-knit rural communities. Bull's friendly demeanor and family connections, which should have been natural and unremarkable, became the source of Rulloff's growing paranoia and rage. The doctor's habit of greeting Harriet with a kiss on the cheek, the same innocent gesture that had triggered Rulloff's wedding day outburst, drove him into paroxysms of jealous fury. Convinced he became that his wife was having an affair with her cousin, despite the complete absence of any evidence to support his suspicions and the ridiculous nature of the accusation given their family relationship. As spring turned to summer in 1845, dangerous proportions were reached by Rulloff's jealousy. He began following Harriet whenever she left the house, questioning her about every conversation she had with other men, and flying into rages over imagined slights and perceived infidelities. The brilliant scholar, who could discuss philosophy and literature with such eloquence, became a monster of suspicion and violence within the walls of his own home. The crisis that would shatter multiple families began in May 1845 when tragedy struck the extended Shutt clan. Gravely ill fell Harriet's sister-in-law, the wife of her brother William, shortly after giving birth to her second child. Both mother and infant were suffering from what appeared to be a serious infection, and the family naturally turned to their relative by marriage, who had established himself as a skilled healer. An herbal remedy using his botanical knowledge was prepared by Rulloff, and he agreed to treat them, administering it personally to both patients with apparent concern for their welfare. Within 48 hours of receiving Rulloff's treatment, both the young mother and her infant child were dead. While such deaths were tragically common in an era before modern medicine and antibiotics, the timing and circumstances struck some family members as suspicious. No grief was shown by Rulloff at their passing, instead making ominous comments to his mother-in-law about who might go next, words that seemed less like expressions of sorrow and more like veiled threats. An immediate and irreparable rift between Rulloff and the Shutt family was created by the deaths. Whispers began to circulate about whether the supposed healer had actually hastened the deaths of his own relatives, though no one dared voice such accusations openly. The family's previous reservations about Rulloff crystallized into active suspicion and hostility, creating a pressure cooker atmosphere that would soon explode into violence. Feeling the weight of his in-laws' suspicion and increasingly desperate to escape the growing hostility around him, more determined than ever did Rulloff become to convince Harriet to abandon her family and move to Ohio with him. Vivid pictures of the new life they could build in the West were painted by him, where his genius would finally receive proper recognition and where they could escape the small-minded gossips who failed to appreciate his exceptional gifts. But Harriet, still grieving the deaths of her sister-in-law and infant niece, was reluctant to leave her family during such a difficult time. Increasingly violent and frequent became the couple's arguments about their future. Rulloff could not understand why his wife would choose loyalty to her family over devotion to him, and his frustration fed the paranoid conviction that she was being turned against him by relatives who had never truly accepted him. His jealousy, always simmering beneath the surface, now boiled over into open accusations of infidelity and betrayal. On the evening of June 22, 1845, as a summer thunderstorm rumbled across Cayuga Lake and lightning illuminated the darkening sky, the crime that would define his legacy and haunt central New York for generations was committed by Edward Rulloff. Thick with tension was the humid air as another argument erupted between husband and wife in their small house in Lansing, this time about Rulloff's increasingly desperate demands that they leave immediately for Ohio. In the kitchen was Harriet, engaged in the mundane domestic task of crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle, when her husband's rage finally reached its breaking point. He had been drinking, which always made his temper more volatile, and his accusations of infidelity had become more wild and specific. When Harriet laughed off his latest charges and firmly refused his demands to abandon her grieving family, something fundamental snapped in the scholar's brilliant but twisted mind. The sequence of events that followed would be recounted years later when Rulloff finally confessed to the crime, providing details that could only have come from someone who was present during those terrible moments. In an explosion of pure rage, fed by months of building resentment and paranoid jealousy, the iron pestle was snatched by Rulloff from his wife's hands and brought down on her forehead with devastating force. With such violence was the blow delivered that Harriet collapsed instantly, blood streaming from the massive wound and pooling beneath her head on the kitchen floor. The sound of the impact and her falling body seemed to echo through the small house, followed by an eerie silence broken only by the rumble of thunder outside. Over his wife's body stood Rulloff, watching as the life drained out of the woman he claimed to love, feeling no remorse but only a cold satisfaction that she would never defy him again. But his crime was not yet complete. As Harriet lay dying on the kitchen floor, their infant daughter, Priscilla, began to cry in her cradle, disturbed by the commotion and perhaps sensing that something terrible had happened to her mother. The sound of the baby's wailing seemed to pierce through Rulloff's rage, reminding him that he now had a witness to his crime, a witness who would someday grow old enough to remember and testify against him. With the same calculating coldness that had marked his academic pursuits, another terrible decision was made by Rulloff. Moving to his collection of botanical medicines, a narcotic was prepared by him, likely a concentrated dose of the same plant-based poisons he had been using to treat patients throughout the region. With the precision of a trained pharmacist was the preparation of the fatal dose done, measuring and mixing ingredients with the same care he had once devoted to healing. Returning to the cradle where Priscilla continued to cry, the poison was administered by Rulloff with gentle hands, perhaps telling himself that he was simply putting the child to sleep. Gradually weakened and then stopped entirely did the baby's cries, leaving the house filled with the kind of terrible silence that would haunt anyone who had witnessed such evil. In the space of less than an hour, the brilliant scholar had destroyed his entire family, transforming from respected healer to cold-blooded killer. Shockwaves through the close-knit community of Lansing and the surrounding Finger Lakes region were sent by the disappearance of Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff in late June 1845. When concerned neighbors came calling the following day and found Rulloff alone in his house, his explanations raised immediate and profound suspicions that would only deepen with each passing hour. A story that contradicted every explanation their host offered was told by the scene inside the Rulloff home. All the signs of hasty abandonment were borne by the house. Beds were left unmade with sheets twisted and thrown aside. Dirty dishes were scattered across the kitchen table where they had apparently been left mid-meal, and personal belongings were scattered haphazardly throughout the rooms. Most tellingly, Harriet's cherished traveling basket, which she never went anywhere without, still sat prominently on her bureau alongside her jewelry and other precious possessions. Only deepened the growing mystery and suspicion did Rulloff's attempts to explain his family's absence. His stories changed with each telling, as if he were improvising details as he went along. Initially, he claimed that Harriet and Priscilla had gone to visit relatives in a cottage between Cayuga and Seneca Lakes. But when pressed for specifics, he couldn't provide exact locations or expected return dates. When this story failed to satisfy questioners, he switched to claiming they were visiting family in Erie, Pennsylvania, and finally settled on an elaborate tale about their relocation to Madison, Ohio. More questions than it answered was raised by each new version of events. Why would Harriet leave without her traveling basket and personal effects? How could she have departed without telling her close-knit family where she was going? What circumstances would have motivated such a sudden and secretive departure? The more Rulloff talked, the less believable his stories became, and the more convinced his listeners grew that something terrible had happened to his wife and child. When confronted directly about these inconsistencies, a letter to his wife was offered to be written by Rulloff, asking her to contact her family and dispel what he characterized as malicious rumors circulating about their welfare. In his precise scholarly hand was the letter duly written, with flowery language expressing concern for her family's worries and requesting immediate communication to set their minds at ease. But days turned to weeks, and no response ever came, a silence that spoke louder than any words could have. For 6 agonizing weeks, his increasingly desperate charade was maintained by Rulloff, playing the role of the concerned husband whose family was simply traveling for reasons he couldn't fully explain. His practice as a botanical physician was continued by him, treating patients with the same apparent skill and compassion that had made his reputation, all while knowing that the bodies of his victims lay hidden beneath the dark waters of Cayuga Lake. But stronger and more focused with each passing day grew the community's suspicions. Rulloff's evolving explanations were refused to be accepted by the Shutt family, led by Harriet's protective brothers, William and Ephraim. Their sister's character intimately was known by them, her deep devotion to family, her responsible nature, and her habit of maintaining regular correspondence with relatives. Completely inconsistent with everything they knew about her personality and values was her sudden disappearance without word. The character of a determined manhunt was taken on by the family's investigation, with William and Ephraim Shutt questioning neighbors, searching the surrounding countryside, and applying increasing pressure on their brother-in-law to provide satisfactory answers. Their efforts were complicated by Rulloff's continued presence in the community and his ability to maintain his facade of respectability, but their persistence began to yield disturbing information about his behavior in the days immediately following the disappearance. Several neighbors came forward to report seeing Rulloff on the morning after his family's supposed departure, loading mysterious bundles and what appeared to be a large, heavy chest into a wagon borrowed from the Anderson family. Nervous and furtive was his demeanor described by witnesses, completely unlike his usual confident bearing. Most significantly, multiple people reported seeing him driving the loaded wagon toward Cayuga Lake in the early morning hours, taking a route that led away from any of the destinations he had claimed his family had traveled to. When the pressure of investigation and community suspicion became too great, suddenly from Lansing vanished Rulloff, claiming he was going to rejoin his family in Ohio and bring them back to silence the unfair accusations being made against him. Only confirmed the community's worst suspicions about his guilt did his departure in the middle of the night, without settling his affairs or providing any forwarding address. But not content to let his sister's suspected killer escape justice through flight was Ephraim Shutt. A man of considerable determination and physical courage, his buckboard was mounted by him and set off in pursuit, beginning a dramatic cross-state manhunt that would take him through multiple cities and railroad stations. A test of wills between a grieving brother seeking justice and a killer desperately trying to escape the consequences of his crimes became the chase. Its climax was reached by the pursuit at a crowded train platform in Rochester, where Rulloff attempting to board a departing train bound for Buffalo and points west was spotted by Ephraim. In a scene that could have been lifted from the pages of a contemporary adventure novel, Rulloff attempted to disappear into the crowd of travelers, using his knowledge of human nature and crowd psychology to evade detection. But stronger than Rulloff's cunning proved Ephraim's determination, and after a thorough search of the train cars, the fugitive hiding in the rearmost compartment was found by him. Even when cornered, his composure was maintained by Rulloff and his deception was continued with remarkable audacity. Rather than confessing or showing any sign of guilt, surprise and pleasure at encountering his brother-in-law were expressed by him, claiming that the meeting was fortuitous since he was indeed on his way to rejoin Harriet and Priscilla in Ohio. With characteristic boldness, he even suggested that Ephraim accompany him on the journey to see for himself that his sister and niece were safe and well. Together in an atmosphere of barely concealed tension traveled the two men, with Ephraim watching his companion's every move while Rulloff maintained his performance as the innocent husband eager to reunite his family. They proceeded to Buffalo where an uncomfortable night at a hotel was spent by them, each man knowing that the other was playing a dangerous game whose outcome could mean life or death. The next morning, as they made their way to the crowded docks to catch an early steamboat for Cleveland, the cunning that would serve him throughout his criminal career was demonstrated by Rulloff. Using the confusion and crowds of a busy port as cover, away from Ephraim's watchful eye he managed to slip, disappearing into the press of passengers boarding the steamboat. By the time Ephraim realized his quarry had escaped, completely had Rulloff vanished, leaving his brother-in-law alone and more convinced than ever that Harriet and Priscilla were dead. Back in Lansing, a systematic search for the missing women was organized by the community that represented one of the most thorough criminal investigations of its era. The focus of their efforts became Cayuga Lake, the longest of the 11 glacial Finger Lakes in central New York based on witness reports of Rulloff's suspicious wagon journey. Teams of men worked in shifts using hooks, nets, and primitive diving equipment to search the lake's murky depths for any trace of the bodies. The search was hampered by the lake's considerable depth and the unclear waters that could hide secrets for decades. Nearly 40 miles extends Cayuga Lake and reaches depths of over 400 feet in some areas, providing countless places where weighted bodies could rest undisturbed. Despite weeks of intensive searching that involved dozens of volunteers and considerable expense, no trace of Harriet or Priscilla was ever found. Increasingly disturbing details about Rulloff's behavior in the days following the murders were revealed by the investigation. Witnesses described his strange alternation between apparent grief and almost cheerful indifference to his family's fate. Most damning was his apparent lack of genuine effort to locate his missing wife and child, behavior completely inconsistent with that of an innocent husband and father whose family had truly vanished under mysterious circumstances. Meanwhile, not been idle during his months of freedom had the brilliant scholar. Continuing his established pattern of reinvention and deception, his way to Meadville, Pennsylvania had been made by him, where under the alias James Nelson he established himself. Once again, his charisma and apparent learning opened doors that should have remained closed to a fugitive from justice, and he was soon accepted into the town's intellectual and social circles. In Meadville, a local inventor and businessman was befriended by Rulloff, convincing him to enter into a partnership that would have provided both financial security and social respectability. So carefully crafted and convincing was his new persona as James Nelson that a professorship at Jefferson College was actually offered to him, a position that would have fulfilled his academic ambitions while providing perfect cover for his criminal past. But his dreams of respectability were shattered when Albert Jarvis, the young man whose family had befriended Rulloff during his time in Ithaca, wrote to inform him that both he and his mother had become convinced of Rulloff's innocence and were working to clear his name. The letter, meant as good news, actually served as a warning that law enforcement officials were closing in on his location and that his time as James Nelson was coming to an end. Inexorably closing in on Edward Rulloff were the wheels of justice, though slow in the 1840s. In 1845, nearly a year after Harriet and Priscilla's disappearance, finally tracked down by determined law enforcement officials was he and arrested on charges related to his family's disappearance. The legal proceedings that followed would span decades and reveal the true extent of his criminal genius as well as the dangerous flaws in the American justice system that allowed such a predator to repeatedly escape punishment. An almost impossible task was faced by the prosecution in trying to convict Rulloff of murder. Without bodies, physical evidence, or eyewitnesses to the actual crimes, they were forced to build their case entirely on circumstantial evidence and suspicious behavior. Recognizing the difficulty of proving murder beyond a reasonable doubt, the grand jury chose instead to indict Rulloff on the lesser charge of kidnapping his wife, a decision that would have profound consequences for the pursuit of justice. His own defense was conducted by Rulloff with the skill and sophistication of a trained attorney, demonstrating legal knowledge that astonished court observers and frustrated prosecutors. Relentlessly on the lack of physical evidence, the absence of bodies, and the entirely circumstantial nature of the case against him focused his arguments. Legal precedents were cited by him with precision, logical arguments that impressed even hostile observers were constructed by him, and witnesses were cross-examined by him with a thoroughness that would have done credit to an experienced trial lawyer. Despite his legal brilliance, ultimately convinced of his guilt was the jury by the overwhelming weight of circumstantial evidence and the implausibility of his various explanations for his family's disappearance. In 1846, guilty of kidnapping was he found and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor at Auburn State Prison, one of New York's most notorious correctional facilities. Rather than breaking Rulloff's spirit or reforming his character, his university and laboratory became prison. Into academic pursuits with obsessive dedication he threw himself, using his confinement to teach himself philology, the scientific study of language development and evolution. Into a scholar's study was transformed his cell, filled with books on linguistics, classical languages, and comparative grammar that he somehow managed to acquire despite the restrictions of prison life. Not merely academic exercises were Rulloff's intellectual pursuits in prison, but part of a grandiose plan to achieve the fame and recognition he believed his genius deserved. What he considered to be revolutionary theories about the formation and evolution of human language were developed by him, working on a comprehensive treatise he planned to title Method in the Formation of Language. Genuinely believed he that this work would establish him as one of the foremost linguistic scholars of his generation and earn him immortality in academic circles. To legendary proportions grew his scholarly reputation within the prison. He was consulted by guards and administrators on matters requiring education and intelligence, fellow inmates were tutored by him in classical languages and mathematics, and even classes for visitors who came to witness the phenomenon of the criminal genius were taught by him. A destination for curious intellectuals and reformers who were fascinated by the paradox of such learning existing within a convicted criminal became his cell. Among those most influenced by Rulloff's apparent reformation and scholarly achievements was Albert Jarvis, the teenage son of the Ithaca undersheriff. Barely out of his teens, but already fascinated by classical learning, Jarvis became Rulloff's most devoted student, spending hours in his cell studying Greek and Latin under the tutelage of the imprisoned scholar. The relationship that developed between teacher and student would prove crucial to Rulloff's future escape attempts and criminal enterprises. When finally released in 1856 after serving his full 10-year sentence was Rulloff, Tompkins County authorities waiting with a new warrant were found by him. This time charging him directly with the murder of his wife, Harriet. Immediately grasped were the implications and potential defenses by his legal mind, and he argued vigorously that this constituted double jeopardy, claiming he could not be tried twice for the same basic crime. A tactical decision that would prove both clever and ultimately futile was made by the district attorney, perhaps recognizing the weakness of the double jeopardy argument or simply wanting to avoid a complex legal battle. Rather than pursuing the charge for Harriet's murder, that case was dropped entirely by him and instead new charges for the murder of infant Priscilla were filed, a separate crime that would not be covered by double jeopardy protections. The second trial, carefully moved to the nearby town of Owego to ensure an impartial jury that had not been influenced by local publicity, again resulted in a conviction and a sentence of death. But not been wasted had Rulloff's legal education during his imprisonment, and a sophisticated appeal was mounted by his defense team, arguing that murder could not be proven in the absence of a corpse, a legal principle known as the corpus delicti rule. As his case worked its way through the higher courts, generating considerable legal precedent and scholarly discussion, for his most audacious escape yet prepared Rulloff. In 1858, while confined in the Ithaca jail awaiting the outcome of his appeal, under circumstances that strongly suggested inside assistance from someone with detailed knowledge of the facility's security procedures vanished he. The most likely explanation for his escape was that Albert Jarvis, now working for his father the undersheriff and still devoted to his former teacher, had helped orchestrate the breakout. An uncanny ability to inspire loyalty and devotion in those around him had always been possessed by Rulloff, convincing them of his innocence through sheer force of personality and intellectual charisma. Free once again and now a fugitive from a death sentence, the most productive and dangerous phase of his criminal career was embarked upon by Rulloff. Extensively throughout the Northeast and Midwest he traveled, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement while continuing both his scholarly work and his criminal enterprises. As extremely dangerous and likely to be armed was he described on his wanted posters, but they could not capture the true nature of his threat, a brilliant mind, utterly without conscience, capable of inspiring trust even while planning betrayal. During these fugitive years, his techniques of deception and reinvention were perfected by Rulloff. Under various aliases, as a teacher, photographer, inventor, carpet designer, and even photographer, he worked, always maintaining the facade of respectability while supporting himself through carefully planned thefts and frauds. His intellectual gifts continued to open doors that his criminal record would have kept closed, allowing him to infiltrate respectable society repeatedly. In 1861, finally ran out when he was captured and returned to New York to face justice. Did his luck. This time, to 2.5 years in Sing Sing prison was he sentenced, the notorious maximum security facility that housed the state's most dangerous criminals. But even in this harsh environment, Thrive managed Rulloff, using his intellectual gifts to earn privileges and make valuable connections that would serve his future criminal enterprises. It was at Sing Sing that William T. Dexter was met by Rulloff, a professional burglar who would become his partner in the crimes that would ultimately seal his fate. Impressed by Rulloff's obvious intelligence and sophistication was Dexter, recognizing that an alliance with such a brilliant criminal mind could be extremely profitable for both of them. Together with the still loyal Albert Jarvis, a criminal gang that would terrorize the Northeast for nearly a decade was formed by them. Sophisticated for the era were their criminal methods, focusing on high-end burglaries that targeted stores carrying expensive fabrics and luxury goods that could be easily transported and sold in distant markets. As the mastermind and planner was Rulloff's role, his superior intelligence allowing him to organize their operations with military precision, while his scholarly reputation provided perfect cover for their activities. Based primarily in Brooklyn, throughout New York, New England, and Pennsylvania operated the gang, building a reputation for professionalism and avoiding violence that made them particularly difficult for law enforcement to track. Comfortable lives between crimes were lived by them, with Rulloff continuing his academic work and even attempting to gain recognition in legitimate scholarly circles. In 1869, at the first convention of the American Philological Association scheduled to be held in Poughkeepsie was learned by Rulloff, and his golden opportunity to break into legitimate academic circles and gain the recognition he had craved for decades was seen by him. Under the carefully crafted alias Professor Yuri Laurio, a manuscript detailing his revolutionary theory of language formation was submitted by him, a work he had been perfecting during his years of imprisonment and fugitive life. The true depth of his megalomaniacal personality and his complete disconnect from reality were revealed by Rulloff's academic ambitions. Genuinely believed he that his linguistic theories would revolutionize the field and earn him immortality as one of history's great scholars. Years of obsessive work were represented by his manuscript method in the formation of language, and convinced was he that it contained insights that would transform human understanding of communication and thought itself. To demonstrate his confidence in the work's value and his desperate need for both money and recognition, his intention to auction the manuscript for the staggering sum of $500,000 was announced by Rulloff, a fortune that would be worth millions in today's currency. Not just his financial desperation, but his grandiose self-assessment and complete inability to gauge the real worth of his theories or the likelihood of academic acceptance were reflected by the astronomical asking price. When not only rejected his manuscript but showed no interest whatsoever in his theories did the Philological Association, volcanic and transformative was Rulloff's fury. The rejection by the very academic community he had spent decades trying to join pushed him over the edge from ambitious criminal to something far more dangerous. If the world would not recognize his genius voluntarily, through increasingly bold and violent crimes he would force them to acknowledge it. All of Rulloff's resentments and paranoid beliefs about society's failure to appreciate his exceptional gifts were crystallized by the rejection. More daring and brutal became his crimes after 1869, as if he were challenging law enforcement to catch him while simultaneously punishing a world that had failed to give him his due recognition. Into something far more dangerous was the brilliant scholar transforming, a killer who felt the world owed him recognition for his superior intellect. It was during this period of escalating violence and desperation that most clearly apparent became Rulloff's true psychopathic nature to those who observed him closely. Virtually every characteristic of clinical psychopathy as we understand it today have been concluded to be displayed by him by modern psychiatrists examining the historical records of his behavior and statements. No genuine remorse for his victims was shown by him, an inflated and grandiose sense of his own importance was possessed by him, a complete lack of empathy for the suffering of others was demonstrated by him, and an unshakable belief in his own superiority was maintained by him, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Yet his charm and intellectual gifts allowed him to continue manipulating those around him with frightening ease. Even fellow criminals were drawn to his magnetic personality and convinced of his exceptional abilities. Loyalty, devotion, and even love in people who should have recognized him as a dangerous predator could be inspired by him, demonstrating the sophisticated psychological manipulation skills that made him far more dangerous than ordinary criminals. As 1870 dawned, increasingly desperate on multiple fronts was Rulloff. His academic dreams had been publicly crushed by the very scholars whose recognition he had sought. His criminal enterprises were barely supporting him and his partners, and time was running short.